Hello, and welcome. It is, of course, Worldbuilding Wednesday, and as always, I'm your host, Casimir Basilius. So, without much further ado, let us world build. Well, with a little further ado, there we are. So, let's get to it. We are, of course, world building today, hopefully to actually get some world building done. Today, I think we're going to talk about nations because I kind of wanted to talk about them before, but sort of got sidetracked. So, nations. Specifically in Galactic Requiem, as we only, well, I say only, yeah, pretty much only. We only ever work on Galactic Requiem. So, if it isn't obvious for the most part, I mean, it says Galactic Requiem right there. So, let's actually get to world building. Well, brief announcement. I am preparing for, well, tomorrow, I believe. If all goes well, tomorrow's going to be our 100th upload. We're going to do a thing, if I can set it all up. It's quite... I'm not the best at setting things up, but yes, tomorrow is our special episode in which we will do special episode things. It's not... Well, yeah, no, that's about it. So, now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's actually, finally, world build. I suppose there's one other thing we should do, which is remove the dice roller so you can see better. So, galactic nations. Where to even begin? As you can see here, we have what could best be described as a galaxy map. It is 1 light year scale. Well, no. I'm used to the old map. The old map was actually 1 light year to 1 square scale. Unfortunately, we ran into issues. Sort of. It's easier to do it this way, in short. Anyway, so, sorry, it's this version of the map. It's not new. But let's put it this way. We've been at this for a long time. Many, many years. And for the majority of years in recent history, we used the 1 light year, 1 square version of the map. So, that's what I'm used to. Anyway, this version of the map is 1 square is 1 sector. It's easier to work with. But, in short, when designing a world, you want a map, of course. How else are you going to... Well, you don't need a map, per se, when designing a world, but I like having a map. So, here we have the galaxy. The light blue circle being the edge of the galaxy. Unfortunately, it's rather difficult to fit circles in circles. So, of course, we used squares to represent the sectors. Of course, there's not necessarily, well, I'm about to get into astronomy nerd things. Technically, this is the edge of the galaxy. I know the squares are square, but I was going to say technically there's nothing outside of the circle, but that's not even true because you know the way galaxies work. There's lots of actually stars and stuff beyond the edge of a galaxy. It's not some sort of hard line that denotes the end of where things are. It's just significantly more sparse beyond the edge of the galaxy, and it gets sparser the further between galaxies you go, but that's not counting rogue planets and all that. Anyway, we're getting into astronomy nerd things. As much as I'd love to, I kind of assured myself we'd talk about nation design this time. So, well, let's get to the actual nation design. Um, because trust me, we could go on and on about astronomy nerd stuff. But world building Wednesday, we should at least talk about the world building of Galactic Requiem. So yes, there are, much like in your universe, things beyond the edge of the galaxy. But in short, the blue line denotes the agreed upon edge of the galaxy. But since we, well, tabletop programs, squares makes it hard to make and measure circles, so we just place them as squares. But of course, the galaxy's circular. Anyway, to the actual main point. Basically, we have one square being a sector. I say a square, I mean one of these squares is a sector of about 150, I say about exactly 150 by 150 light years per every one of these sub-squares. Then we have larger scale squares. I believe we consider these megasectors. And then the big square, not all of them, but one of these blocks basically, is a gigasector or something like that. But in short, every square is a sector. Of course, when designing the world, we didn't fill every sector. Of course, given the limitations of working with maps in general, you see there's nothing in there, they're just used to represent movement, of course. Here, we have an example of what a sector would look like, using a sector map, which we actually just shrunk a sector map down to give an example of what the scale would be. So, every one of these, purple, it's hard to point because it's literally the smallest scale. Every one of these purple little squares is a light year. Of course, normally on a sector map we have a grid in between them. But in short, it basically light years, blocks of 15 light years. There's 10 of them making 150 light years across in a sector. Anyway, so when working on Galactic Requiem, we have a lot of sectors that are mapped. We don't, of course, have small versions of them placed here. There's no real point in that. As well, you can't really use the small version because, well, there's no grid snapping or anything. But, like, of course, for instance, you can quite easily go to, say, a map that is an actual sector map in which, well, you can actually show the grid and move around it. Anyway, so in short, we have a lot of sector maps. We, of course, don't have sector maps for everything. A galaxy's massive. But in short, we have a galaxy map and a lot of sectors in it, but not all of them. And that's when we get down to our topic for the day. I just had to sort of cover that groundwork, or at least I feel I had to cover that groundwork to cover our topic today. Our topic today, of course, being nations and the galaxy and society in Galactic Requiem. So, here, of course, we have, as mentioned, galaxy map. Nations in Galactic Requiem, of course, when designing worlds, there are bits you need to work on, bits you don't necessarily need to work on. Of course, in the end, it would be nice to have a galaxy filled with everything, but actually designing worlds and societies and cultures and everything takes time and effort. So, of course, there are limitations. Now, one of these limitations being, as mentioned, well, let's start with the Terran nations. It's I need a nation to give an example of what I'm talking about. So we'll start with the Terran nations because that's where our solo campaign is taking place. Here we have, as you can see, the Terran nations. A territory of loosely aligned factions. Well, yeah, no, that's it. A territory of loosely aligned factions called the Terran nations. They contain in their territories several sectors. In these sectors, as they are an independent nation, they have many independent nations, like sub-nations that have their own rules, laws, cultures, governments, etc., all within their main territory. So, when designing worlds, we of course, as we run tabletop RPGs, for our story writing, we'll design what's needed. We'll of course come up with loose ideas, rules, laws, territories in these territories. Locations within territories, basically, representing different things. So, forgive me, I'm doing rather terrible at explaining. Um, let me gather my thoughts for a second. So, what I'm trying to say is basically, there are areas, there are different tiers. There are different tiers of detail. There's different amounts of detail that can be applied in any given area, that are applied in any given area. For instance, of course, the area that our solo tabletop RPG takes place in is more defined than, say, a random sector. Of course, given the, as mentioned, scale of space, we of course don't have every corner of the Terran nations mapped. We don't have every bit of their government written down. So sometimes we do have every bit of a government written down. But the Terran nations, specifically plural nations, being several semi-independent nations, well, they're rather varied and scattered. You might as well consider them multiple nations, you know? So, basically, we have amounts of detail added. Of course, the area, as mentioned, that our solo campaign takes place in, has more detail than some places and less detail than others. It is one of the more detailed places. But if you were to pick a random area of the map out at absolute random, it's more than likely not detailed. But there are ideas, cultures, not cultures, ideas and concepts. That's the other word I was thinking of. Ideas and concepts applied to them and to the territory, nation, area, etc. For instance, let me get you a slightly better example. Um, Assuming I can find it. Hmm, half a second. Here's what we're looking for. For instance, no? Yeah. Yes, okay, good. For instance, if you know, one of the sectors we've worked on not in the Terra Nations is the Sacred Grove sector. It's a deep frontier sector. The deep frontier is rather unexplored. In my notes for the Sacred Grove sector, we have, for instance, Sacred Grove itself. By the way, I suppose we'll point it out. When I say deep frontier, Sacred Grove is over here. It is about 300 or so. We can actually check. Please tell me I noted it. I did not. Unfortunate. Sacred Grove is. Oh no. That's what I get for having multiple campaign files. It's about 300 or so sectors away from civilized space. We can actually just measure. From the core, the council capital, it is 434 sectors away. So, in short, it's far away. That's the point. Now, of course, if we actually swap over, you can see the map of Sacred Grove. It's, of course, not completed, but you get an idea of what a sector map is. It's the one we showed before. Let's remove the grid so we can zoom in without it getting all. Basically, you have a lot of detail. We have the law, we have information, we even have corporations in the capital of Sacred Grove. We have ideas of how the Sacred Grove government works. We have all of that and more. I mean, we can calculate their economic output, we can calculate their population, we can calculate all this stuff, and some of that stuff is calculated in my notes, not the in-game notes in the actual notes file. Anyway, so the further out you get, just outside of the sector, we have lessened but still notes that describe the location. For instance, in my notes it says nearby sectors. To the north are scattered civilizations of lesser and mid-tier. To the east are many packed in one like just a packed area of lesser and mid-sized civilizations. To the south are scattered civilizations once again. And to the west is mostly empty civilization. However, it has many pirates. Of course, players have been to some of these places, and there are little bits marked out in them, but we have notes that basically denote information on certain locations. For instance, you can have as little as to the east are scattered areas. You could have paragraphs relating to certain locations in those sectors, etc., etc. So there are different tiers, but as, of course, the designer and GM, I have ideas about what are in those, and generally I store those in my notes. Of course, there's also things I know about the galaxy and the way things work. So when designing a world, you don't necessarily need all of the most, like you don't need every bit of granular detail, but it is good to have an idea and some amount of detail to work with, an idea of what's in an area, you know? Because that'll help you build it out. For instance, we understand how the Commonwealth works. Commonwealth being another faction. We understand how the Commonwealth works. They're a xenophobic, militarist dictatorship in the galactic core, the core nations, if you will. And basically, we know for a fact it's unlikely to find Commonwealth forces outside. You're not going to find planets of the Commonwealth outside of Commonwealth territory due to the fact that they're a xenophobic faction. However, there are little bits of Commonwealth holdings outside. It is not likely you'd run into one. So when running the game and so forth, or writing, we know that it would be a very special occasion for when there's Commonwealth forces outside of Commonwealth territory. that kind of thing. That's a rough example of how logic sort of guides the way things work. Of course, there's you get into deeper and deeper bits of detail. Like, of course, there are Commonwealth mercenary factions that definitely don't work for the Commonwealth government as plausible deniability, hint, hint, wink, wink, outside of the Commonwealth territory. No, no, definitely not. I mean, of course there are, but generally, due to the nature of the Commonwealth, doesn't have holdings outside of their territory, although they tried recently during the Second Galactic War a few times to influence and gain a few bases outside of Commonwealth territory, officially, semi-officially. So, it's this kind of thing that guides rules. Basically, what I'm trying to say is you need to know your world. You need to know your world. And having, well, designed my world, I have quite a good idea of how it works. So, let's see. So, we have, in short, what I'm trying to say, we have basic rules, guidelines, things that guide the way these civilizations work, even within their own territories. So, for instance, as this is the Terran nations, it is unlikely, not impossible, but unlikely to find planets full of aliens in the Terran nations, given the fact that it's run by the Terran nations, even though we haven't designed every single square light year of the Terran nations, let alone every system. We know that predominantly it's going to be filled with Terrans from the Terran nations. However, we are, I say we, I mean the galaxy, is technologically advanced. So, of course, define Terran. Do you consider genetically engineered beings Terrans? How genetically engineered does a being have to be before it's not Terran? Which is something we discussed last time, I suppose. But, mind upload, genetic engineering, etc., etc. But also, again, that's not to say there can't be planets or even systems full of aliens in the Terran nations. It's just not something likely to happen. There would have to be specific instances, specific logic behind such a thing happening. The same sort of overall concept can be said of relations between nations. There must be sense, logic, and all that between, well, in every aspect of building a world, there must be logic and sense. And there can be exceptions, but they must be noted as, I say noted as like there's a note there, but my point is you must specifically have reason for exception and logic behind it. For instance, if I'm making an exception, I'm going to add more detail. You know how I said, like, a paragraph of detail works. Yeah, but in a sense of this area is filled with mid or lesser tier nations, you're going to need more than that if you have an exception. Personally, I'd probably go with multiple paragraphs of details if I was making a sort of exception to a rule when designing a nation. Why is there a planet full of aliens in the Terran nations? There's probably some history behind that, some reasoning, some logic that you're probably going to want to go into detail for if you have something that is, say, strange within the logic of the world. And again, the same can be said about not only placement of, say, systems with strange things around our worlds, but in any bit of world building. Like, basically, Let's see. What are the relations between Altor and the Enster? Altor and the Enster are quite notoriously enemies. Enster being aliens that have no regard for any non-Enster life. Altor being primarily Terrans. As you can see, being the Enster being non-Terran aliens with little regard for anything that isn't Enster, bordering the nation of Altor, who, well, weren't the most combat-oriented nation, and a bit less advanced than the Enster. The Enster have what ranges on tech level 20 to 22 biotech. They're exceptionally good at biotech. So, and they're decent at everything else. And by decent, I mean galactic standard. Altor being, well, galactic standard in everything, if not lesser, Altor wasn't super industrialized. Don't get me wrong, they were industrialized. They are a space nation, but they're not super industrial focused. So, in their dealings, I say dealings, many wars with the Enster, basically, they didn't do well. Enster took a lot of their worlds, killed a lot of their people, captured a lot of their people, etc., etc. So, of course, we have some logic to use at play here. Would the Enster and Altor have good diplomatic relations? No. The border between the Enster and Altor in the current era is probably militarized. On the border, you can probably find dead, destroyed, damaged, and worlds that are just not in the best condition, while you could also find militarized worlds. This is because of the history of wars and conflict between the two nations. Now, of course, we don't have information on every conflict that happened between the two, but we know that there are and were constant conflicts between the two. So we're safe to assume that the border area, even if we don't have an exact map for the border area, is in a state that would reflect this. And these are things you must keep in mind when designing worlds. I know it seems rather obvious, but I mean, sometimes you have to point out the obvious. So it's relatively small things like this that are implied. Basically, it's implied facts. Implied things that you apply, that will implied that you apply when designing worlds, building things, etc. If my players basically said, we want to go to the border between Altor and the Enster, that's what I would make them find there. Certain worlds would be heavily militarized. Certain worlds would be just ravaged by the war. Also, things to keep in mind is when these battles happen and so forth. Of course, if the battle happened long ago, certain things might have been rebuilt. Or maybe the worlds were abandoned, etc., etc. These are all just things you need to keep in mind when proceeding with such things. So, even if we don't have an exact map of the area, we have an idea of what happened there, an idea between the relations of these two nations, and all of that. So, when building worlds, you can sort of, even if, like, let me put it this way. If my players want to do an entire campaign in a place, I'll work on that place. I'll add all sorts of details and connections. Don't get me wrong. I'll go overboard on details and connections and lore and locations and relations between factions. You don't need to, but you can, and I do. But if they were to say, go to a place that just off the bat, without me preparing, which they're allowed to do, because I run Sandbox. So if they're like, let's go over here, right now, we want to no delay, go over here. I have a groundwork to work with and ideas to apply to an area or location or so forth that implies and helps with creating what we often call a living world. Now, of course, simulating a world is no small task. So it's small bits like this, small yet vague, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a word for it. Not simplification, not fuzziness, not haze, but it's basically this. I, I'm at a loss for the word, but it's this simplification of it that makes it work. You don't necessarily need every single bit of anything done to have a living world. Of course, like I said, I would then go into detail after I'm over the initial shock phase of the players going, let's go here, and me not being expected, well, not expecting it or being necessarily prepared for it. Of course, they might go to a place in which things are already written for. That is possible, in which case I'll just bring up my notes for that place. But it is also more likely they'll probably end up somewhere that does not have information on it, and thus we have to use inferences from the greater world from the greater universe to fill in the details in an accurate way that pertains to the living world. Everything that happens in the world, however, is of course persistent and affects things. If the players do something in a sector that applies in that sector, and we take note of it, and the effects might ripple out or radiate out, affecting a wider area. Now that's unlikely usually. It's not usual that a few individuals can affect such a large scale, but it is possible. But that's the very basics, I suppose, of well, filling in details. We have a groundwork to work with, a ground. I believe that's correct terminology. We have a groundwork to build upon, and ideas of what's in places, and all of this that we can work with. And then everything that happens gets noted down, and basically any information characters get about a place, anything that happens, I take notes of. In addition to the notes I make in preparation, anything the players learn in a session, or anything I write down when writing a book, gets noted and basically becomes part of what's in that place, part of what's going on there. And these things can change over time. Sometimes it's fun to go back and see how things have evolved without necessarily having people go back there necessarily. But we also do, as I think I mentioned before, simulate the world on a large scale. For instance, we will sometimes just roll random events. We will roll nation turns using the vague nation rules, see what's happening in the galaxy, roll little news stories, that kind of thing, to sort of simulate, to see if there's anything big happening in the world. Now, of course, I could have, of course, always say that something happens in the world. Well, the Commonwealth are doing this. They're working on this project. But I like being surprised. I like using all random generators to see what new has happened in the world, because I like having the world also be living from my own perspective. I like seeing things evolve naturally and deducing what happens based on the charts we roll on and get. Basically, making it even making it so even I don't necessarily know what's going to happen. And of course, for vague nation turns, they're rolled using rules. So I have an idea of how things might go, but it can still surprise me. What if the Empire tries something and rolls a 1? Well, things might fail, etc., etc. And it's these concepts, these ideas that make the world flow, that make the world alive. And you don't need to do roles per se to see what's happening. That's just, I prefer personally having some idea outside of my own just saying things happen. I'm very details oriented. I like things working within the system. I like working within the rules of the game, basically. I don't like saying, well, the Commonwealth wins this war. While it is allowed, etc., I don't like just going, well, in the history of the Commonwealth win this war. I like rolling and even in a vague sense, figuring out what happens. But that is something you can do when world building. Be like, okay, so in the history, this faction succeeds at this, and they're going to do this and this and this, which is usually the way most writers go about writing. You decide. But as we also run a tabletop RPG, I like rolling for a lot of it because we have a system to do so. So that's a big part of the way the world runs. But how do you do that if you don't necessarily know what's in an area or everything about it? Well, you have to simplify. You have to use vague assumptions. However, these assumptions unfortunately can be inaccurate and lead to inaccuracies in a sense. But that's to be loosely expected in such a thing, which is why we try to go with vague averages. What is the average stats of a major space nation? What's the rough average and what few modifiers can we apply? We might be inaccurate, but it's vague enough that it works. So it's just a lot of stuff like that. Um, hmm. So, let's see. Also, in addition, uh, as I think I mentioned, we're working on, well, well, a lot of the fun comes in when you actually zoom in on locations. Now, vague overviews are nice. They help you get things done, or they help me get things done with the insane way I run the game. But they help on a overall sense. It's the little details of world building that I am personally a fan of. I like zooming in on a sector, designing a nation, designing a paragraph of information for a corporation, that kind of thing, which is the stuff we're supposed to be doing on World Building Wednesdays. But, I mean, we'll try and do it more. But basically, that's where I personally like the details. I like the little information between worlds. What is the exact little paragraph of history that happened between these two nations? What corporations were involved in this? What do they produce? What do they build? Etc., etc. But it's the funnest part of it, but it feels to me often like I'm getting very little work done. Because in a world as, well, I say a world, in a universe as vast as this is, with a galaxy as big as this is, one corporation on one planet that players might never visit feels like a waste of work. Now, different player groups are different, don't get me wrong, but often, at least as far as I've seen, even my most dedicated of players don't necessarily they don't necessarily look into they look into the lore. They like learning about areas, don't get me wrong. And as I think I mentioned before, those little bits of details can be very important. I think I mentioned before, I had players who went out of their way to acquire a gun from a world. A singular gun from a singular frontier world. Not even a good gun per se, but they were on that world once. They learned about that world. That world basically hasn't come up. But just these little details can mean something to your players. But it's not, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's not like your players are necessarily, however, going to look into the corporate structure of a corporation that's not necessarily tied to any campaign or event. You know, you don't necessarily need to stat out the corporate structure of a weapons manufacturer that manufactured a single gun in a single system for one thing. I like doing it, but it feels like a waste of time and effort because more than likely the players aren't going to look into it. And I'm the kind of person, when running a game, as I said, sandbox. So I'm not going to force the players to look into it. So it sometimes can feel like a waste of effort. But I like having lots of details. So it's a balance. It really is a balance. So I I'm not sure if anything I said over up until now has made any sense whatsoever. Um my brain isn't working well. Um I had a loose idea of what I was trying to explain, and then I feel like I explained it in a way that made no sense at all whatsoever. But that's sometimes just how it goes. Um, the one time we actually focus on a world building topic as I want, and I feel like I've made no sense doing it. Lovely. Um, so basically, yeah, no, there are, in short, it's just, well, I don't know what to say other than restating it, really. That's one way to work on a world. A vague concept that you fill in with more and more detail as you go, or as you wish, or as people explore it, you fill it in with more and more detail as you want, or all of that, until you have concepts for areas, that's the vague bits, and then high details for places that are needed. And then, if there are any exceptions, those exceptions are things that have lots of detail. You know, for instance, an example of that in a good way would be to say, I'm thinking of a good example. So I'm trying to think of an easy and good example. We'll use the Empire. So this is a hypothetical. This is not a thing that has occurred or has happened that I know of. This is a pure hypothetical. Basically, for example of what I mean when I say exceptions need more detail, if I were to say, which is this bit is accurate, aliens, also known as non-Terrans, in the Empire cannot hold the position of Lord. If there is an exception to this, let's say, so it's safe to assume, given all the lore and everything we know about Imperial Lords, it is safe to assume that all the territory in the Empire is ruled over by a variety of Imperial Lords, and it is safe to assume that all these lords are Terran or within the variance of what's allowed for Imperial nobility. If we were to say, oh yes, there's also an alien lord, we need to explain this. This is something that goes against pre-established statements. It is an exception. And as such, we're going to need reasoning. We're going to need an explanation. Why is that? Because immediately, if the base statement is Imperial Lords cannot be aliens, and then we have an alien Imperial Lord, why? How? These are just immediate questions that pop to mind. Why? Because, I mean, Imperial law and such states it. How? Because, well, it's against the code. You need good explanation. Now, there isn't, so I don't have any good answer for you because clearly there isn't any alien Imperial Lords. At all. Never have been at all. No. So it's these exceptions that need explanation. Maybe they were a war hero. Maybe they served the Empire well. Maybe the leader of the Empire granted them the title, because that would be, well, one of the few ways it would be possible. If the leader of the Empire were to say, you are an Imperial Lord, well, there's not anything anybody could do about it. However, of course, that might cause problems in a sense of Imperial Lords would complain, aliens would complain, everybody would complain, but it would make sense. It would not be necessarily random. It would not defy the law. Now, the next question that would be asked is, why would the leader of the Empire give this alien an exception? Of course, that's my point in you need detail. Just saying, okay, so Imperial Lords have to be Terran. Okay, we know that. That's an established fact. There's this one that's an alien. Okay, why? The leader of the Empire granted them their title. Okay, why? Because it's not saying why as in why is it this way. It's curiosity. Why did we need more detail, more explanation? Why did the leader of the Empire grant this alien a title of Imperial Lordhood when aliens are generally not considered lords? And you get more and more detail from there until you have an explanation that, well, makes sense and doesn't just defy logic. Technically, it doesn't defy logic to simply say, well, because the leader of the Empire said, well, gave them the title, that would work, but still, questions arise that would be nice to be answered from that. Questions I personally would feel would need to be answered. So that's what I mean when I say exceptions require detail. But like this can be applied to anything. This is applied, all these statements about building vague and then adding detail or building detail when things where you want them and so forth applies to everything. Same with the whole other bit about exceptions. All of this applies to basically everything, not just nations. It applies to basically everything. You have levels of detail and you apply them as needed and or where wanted. You don't necessarily have to only apply detail where the players are or where the story is taking place. You can world build for yourself. You can add detail because you want to add detail. You can build something because you want to build something. You know? You're not limited to only doing it where needed. But of course, when mapping an entire universe, it is suggested. You know, like, I'm not going to start world building up here for no reason, you know, unless I plan on making a campaign up there, because that feels like it'd just be a waste of everything. But then again, that could just be me not wanting to, because like I said, world build because you want to. If I wanted to run a campaign up there, then I might detail that area and so forth. I personally like working on things that relate to the stories or relate to campaigns because it makes me feel like I'm not wasting time while also world building and doing what I like, you know? Let's see. Um, I, however, don't know what else to say. I mean, we of course still have time. I mean, we always have time, but like, it's not like there's anything I need to do, per se. But I know I'm doing absolutely terrible about talking about what I wished to. So, uh, where do we go from here? I suppose that's the question. Hmm. Uh, let's see. One moment. I am going to quickly grab a coffee. My apologies. Okay, the coffee is being prepared. Let's see. So, I suppose we'll just talk very briefly about the plans, as I can't really think of what else we're supposed to cover. I covered most of what I wanted to, like I said, just poorly. So tomorrow, something I was preparing for before stream, trying to get things prepared. Tomorrow is what we're going to do is have our 100th upload. Because this is our 99th upload, or will be. And so we're going to have a little special event. And of course, that means I'm preparing a lot of little things, but we'll see how that goes. Hopefully it goes well. Other than that, so tomorrow's special event, that would be Thursday. Friday, we're going to have our solo TTRPG stream. Saturday, we might return to Armor. And that is the plan. If things go exceptionally well, we will have our News Tuesday. If things go well. It really depends on if we have time. I might get called away by Imperial, well, authorities to attend to Imperial business, as is so often the case. But if not, we'll do that on those days. Only, well, on Tuesday we'll do news, if that works out. And if things work exceptionally well, if things go exceptionally well, we might have a lore video on the 28th. Maybe. If things go exceptionally well. Once again, it really depends on how much time we can acquire away from Imperial business. I suppose this stream will be a bit shorter than the others. Yeah, as well, I have to go and finish for preparation for tomorrow's thing. I thank you for stopping by. We didn't really cover much. We rambled a lot. And next Worldbuilding Wednesday, we'll try and do better. We will always try and do better. We're not going to succeed at it, but we'll at least try. Thank you all for stopping by. As always, I've been your host, Casimir Basilius, and I hope that you, yes, you, have had a wonderful day.